Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's Pivot and Reset webinar with an equity lens. With us this afternoon, we have Dr. Gracie Branch, NAESP's Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning. Hi, Gracie. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Honor. I am so excited to be here today. We have a great panel of expertise here, and I'm excited to get to introduce them today. I feel like we have NAESP royalty in the room. We've got Kimbrell Lewis, our past president. We've got Liza Carabella Suarez, who is our current NAESP vice president. We've got Nicole Moore Sampson and Annette Sanchez, who are members. Well, all of these great people are members of our National Task Force on Race and Equity. And then, of course, we have Tom Payton, who's one of our current NAESP board members and also on this great task force. They have a lot of wonderful information to share with you today, so let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to go right into talking about our guiding principles. NAESP formed this task force last summer, June of last year, which seems like a long time ago in light of COVID, with a specific purpose to address issues related to race and equity in light of social injustice, and also to collect research that would be impactful to our members and principals in leading schools. We worked together with the staff to find the best and most practical ways to impact equity in your schools and address racial and social issues. These are the guiding priorities for NAESP, and we will elaborate on them a little bit more. Strengthening principals as leaders of equity, school assessment and action planning, equity-aligned policy, and advocacy. The first guiding priority encompasses having personal reflection on race and implicit bias, and you will hear more about implicit bias with the results of the assessment from last winter, and encouraging listening to what's happening in your schools with your staff and your students, and also taking on courageous conversations to challenge inequity in your community and in your schools. The second guiding priority is school assessment and action planning, and learning how to curate tools that will help us as school leaders do audits and to understand where we are when we address equity and infuse practical ways to address and include various cultures in our schools, and also taking a look at the curriculum and access that our students have. Are we looking at text and assignments to ensure that our students are reflected in that text and the assignments, and also are they equitable based on student background, and are we helping to equip students to fill gaps? We wanted to look at school-wide equity training, so we have vetted resources to share with you, and you'll learn more about that as we go along. Equity-aligned policy and advocacy agenda. NAESP gains great insight from talking to our members and getting your feedback and learning about your professional needs. And we take all of that information and review it and work with our equity, with the advocacy area in NAESP to ensure that there are targeted priorities for principal professional development funding and to support leading equity in our schools.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Today I'm going to talk about what is an equity audit. NAESP has done numerous of partners with NAESC. But before I even get there, let me just talk a little bit about what is an equity audit. Equity audit is a study of the fairness of the way we have policies, programs, and practices out of school. It's looking at those policies and different types of programs that we have for children and how it applies to all students or just some students. It might be difficult at times because it does take time to involve all stakeholders and be able to select or review materials that already exist in your buildings. And then once you review those policies, then the time it takes to make changes in your building, as some of those might move smoothly, and the next steps that as a group you decide as to how we can rectify some of these policies and practices. Why? Why should we have inequity in our schools? Inequity audit. Well, one of the impacts of regular congressional review of the Elementary and Secondary Act, it states that it brings attention to persistent disparity in the learning experiences and opportunities that are offered in the United States schools. So as a result, some of the schools have already incorporated equity components into the organizational improvement plans. However, it takes time, as I mentioned before, but an equity audit comes in different ways. For example, you have the self-awareness to mandate sorry about that. It takes time for you to self-assess your school to see if you comply with the mandates in the federal law. So that's very important. And then you have to look at the framework that exists in your schools to see if you need a quick harness that is credible evidence in servicing of meeting important local needs related to the educational equity. Now, the next thing would be scope. What does that mean? Well, do I have to take the whole entire school, or should I narrow it down? It is advisable that you first narrow it down to practices or policies or the procedures that are currently in your school. And that, of course, comes with all the stakeholders reviewing all of the practices, policies, and procedures in your class. So it does take time. It's rather to be small than large. Now, is it challenging? Of course it's challenging. It depends on society, the organization, and personal values that has taken into place. One of the things that you might do is looking at the history of your school. For example, the school leadership. Equity may never have been an acknowledgement on that area before. Sometimes you don't have the disaggregated data that you need for your students or staff that may be available. Or you might think that you might have an attitude, or some people might have an attitude that it's not their problem. Whatever it is, it can interfere and generate resistance to an order. So these are the challenges that you might come across as leaders, but that's okay. Next. So one of the things that, sorry, next. Yeah, okay. So with NAESP, together with some of our members and the task force, we piloted, we took a test, and you can see the results of some of the implicit associated with this results. I am not going to go into reading everything, but I just want you to focus on some of the numbers that might bring some attention to you. Little to no preference between African Americans and European Americans, slightly preference for European Americans or Afro-American, or moderate preference for European Americans or Afro-Americans. However, with all these results, we were able to partner with Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium, and we were able, as a group, to give feedback to the questions that you're currently here that will help leaders focus more on their, have NAESP help us out on how we can help our own members here. So if you look at some of the questions, my focus to you is, let's look at question number 1. So what do you feel prepared to lead a school culture that affirms students from different racial, ethnic, and cultural background? You have 2.1% not prepared, but I'm going to focus on somewhat prepared, 41.6, and then you have prepared, 37.6, very prepared, 18.7. So I'm going to ask you to quickly look at this and look at how many, in the next question, how many schools are really prepared? For example, to what extent do you feel prepared to implement anti-racist practice in your school? 36 0.5%, only 36%. Question number 3, to what extent does your school curriculum emphasizes historical contribution from individual of color? Minor emphasis, 71.7%. This is something that brings attention to all of us. To what extent does the school curriculum emphasize historical contribution for immigrant? Minor emphasis, 67.7%. Number 5, in an average school year, how much implicit bias training professional development do you receive? Again, not much, but look at some, 45.8%. This is something that we should all be mindful as to how it applies to our school. Number 6, do you feel equipped to support your teachers and staff in providing implicit bias training? Somewhat. Again, somewhat is 63.4%. Again, something that makes you want to think. Next, please. Now, those who took it, you have 67% females, 32% males. The race, the most, it's all listed here, 82% were mostly white. And then how do you describe your school? We have 20.8 urban, 55% for suburban, and rural is 23.8. Now, this is just an idea. It's not everyone, but with this little framework that we have here has given us the opportunity, NAESP, the task force, to work and reach out to Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. Next, please. And these are the tips. Now, they have prepared a wonderful tool for many of our school leaders that is divided into three aspects to kind of help us focus again on where do we need to review our policy, our practices, or our procedures in our own school. Next, please. So we have criteria for equitable schools, criteria for equitable classrooms, teacher behavior that encourage student persistence. All of these the tool that we have here is an awesome tool, so it can give you an insight on how you, your staff, your stakeholders can actually refine, revise, and see where you need to focus so that all students are given the opportunity to learn, whether they're gifted, whether they're not gifted. This is something that can help you as school leaders or help your school. Now, you yourself can download this equity tool. Again, it's we here at NAESP work, and it is a very good. It has lots of questions. Again, it focuses on 3 areas to see if there is equitable learning environment that allows students and staff to perform at the highest level. Again, just to recap, conducting a school-wide equity audit. According to Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium, an equity audit is a study of the fairness of an institution's policy, programs, and practices. The MAEC free audit, you can focus on criteria for equitable schools, equitable classrooms, teacher behavior, and you can download a free equitable adult audit. I've listed the website. It is an awesome website to give you an insight how you can perform this at your school and how can it help your school.
Hello, I guess I'm next, and Thomas Payton and I will be going through the next section. And what do we do with all of this? And we're going to talk a little bit about building belonging. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. First of all, we have to be conscientious of our own biases. All of us, and I think just setting the tone for that with your staff, with your people, and saying, okay, everyone here has, has bias. And that's because we all come, from different backgrounds, different cultures. These past years have been hard because we have dealt with issues across our country with racial injustice. And we have to be prepared as leaders to not only be conscientious, but also to speak freely, and then look at the data. What does the data look like? And take a look at our systems within that, building relationships. I have asked my faculty before, like, how do you define equity? What's the difference between equality and equity? And then kind of speak about diversity. I also believe that we have to provide a diverse staff. So our students have those role models that they can look at. And that's exactly right. Somebody put data is so important because, not only looking at data, as Black versus white, but looking at opportunity gaps, all your different programs. Are there children who are not getting the opportunity that they need? And like I said, the data does not lie. Creating a library for your staff, either virtual or real libraries. There's so many books out there. I'll tell you, and if you'll write it down, I just got a book, just ordered it, and it's called The Sandwich Swap. And it's really good for elementary kids. I would share it with your faculty first, and then go ahead and after that, they can share it with their students, but it's called The Sandwich Swap. I also have like cool books, and I'm kind of a book nerd. So I'm going to share this book too, is really good. It's called I Am Enough. And it's a really, really neat book for kids. Also, Sophia Valdez, Future President. There's some good books, and just books too about kindness and kind of talking about that. And also, because like I said, as leaders, sometimes it's hard. We have to make sure that we are equipped before we equip others, and kind of find out where we're coming from, bringing our backgrounds, and then making sure that we're learning about all these other cultures and everything to stay connected, not only to our faculty or to our kids. I noticed there is a lot of misconception just talking to people. People think, what, should I teach the African American way, or the Mexican way, or the Asian way? And that's misguided. We need to look at how we can connect and how we can bring that. There are little things even, we have Muslim families within our community, and also various backgrounds, but even the little thing of like the Polar Express, right? So we all go and we look at the Polar Express, and, talking to staff, like a lot of y'all know that Muslims aren't able to eat pork, but do you know that they can't eat marshmallows because of the gelatin in there? And there are just so many things that you can go through and talk to staff. Walk through your classroom, be aware, and be courageous. And I'll tell you, I don't have a whole lot of time, but I have some time to talk. I'm timing myself as I talk. I'm usually fast and furious. But I was in a classroom, and I walked in, and I'm doing a regular walk-through observation. And the story is about the little red hen. So there's this one little girl, and she's in the back, and the teacher's like, who wants to be the little red hen? And she's like, I want to be the little red hen. And she's raising her hand, and the teacher is definitely skipping her over. Now, this is a little girl that, doesn't have a rich background, comes from a low socioeconomic. And I'm sitting back thinking, why isn't she calling on this child? Well, she ends up calling on a little boy in that class. And that little girl stands next to the boy, and she's reminding them what the lines are and going through all of that, and I immediately thought, what, a conversation needs to take place. And I pulled the teacher aside, and I said, hey, why didn't you call on her? She's like, well, I wasn't sure she would be able to get it, so I wanted to give somebody else an opportunity. I said, I get it, but you know what? That could have been her breakout moment. That particular time, and I was exiting, and I said, you know what, you may have not been the main character. I said, but you're the director, and she gave these big smiles. But what what are we missing sometimes as educators that we are just letting slide by? Because the minute we let things slide by, that's when it affects our kids that we love, and you need to build your capacity and that of your staff. So walk through the classrooms, be courageous, talk about the inequities, and then also provide PD for your staff. You know, there are several PDs on cultural sensitivity, and we need to make sure that we start with the teachers' cultures and build that and learn about that. And seek out those lead ambassadors in your school. You would be surprised at your staff in talking to the staff, have one-on-one conversations about how many people are willing to go and take that charge, but they have fear. And like I said, we have dealt with so much as a country, and when all that was going on, there's some people that said nothing, you know, because they said, oh, our kids are still in elementary. And my thing is they were seeing it at home. They were hearing it at home. And like I said, we need to be there and to be available and to make sure that we are at the school doing whatever it takes to make sure that not only that there's equality, but that there's equity. And then reflect and reevaluate. You know, I can't stress enough about looking at your system. What is enhancing your system? And then also, you know, what's keeping you back? And you know, that implicit bias that we took, the survey that we took, is just, it's life-changing, because you go and you look at it and it's eye-opening. And, you know, I would encourage you to take that survey for yourself, because it talks about the different biases that we have that we don't even know we have. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and go back. Some of you asked about the books, and one of them was The Sandwich Swap. And we're doing a book study on that. The other one is Kindness is My Superpower. Sophia Valdez, Future President. And there's several, this author does an exceptional job. And I Am Enough. And like I said, there are so many cool books out there, and bringing out the cultures of our kids is just, it's eye-opening. This morning we had a kid, and I still have some time left, but we had a kid come in and she brought her book and she said, look, Miss Sanchez, I brought my book and I'm going to teach my class about my culture and about living in India. And so she came in, and I had to take a snapshot of that. I tweeted out, put it on Facebook, but it's bringing out early, catching kids early, and feeding into not only building change and building capacity, but leading change. So thank you all so much for listening to me. And next is Thomas Payton.
Hi, all. Great resources that Annette was talking about, and excellent strategies to use with your staff. One thing that I did in order to build belonging, and just a little brief synopsis of my school. I'm in a diverse district on the east end of Long Island. I'm the only principal of color in our district. My school in particular is 65% Latino, 11% Black. The rest is made up of white, and I'm in 85% free and reduced lunch. And my staff is mostly homogenous white. So one thing I wanted to do was make connections with each other and show the differences that we all have, but also show the similarities too, and that also helped build culture. So one of the activities I did in a staff meeting was Know Yourself First. It was a Who Am I? And I started with a sheet. It said, I am ... I gave the staff 60 seconds to write every descriptor they could of themselves. It was very important that I did this myself too. And then after 60 seconds, by doing this activity with my staff, I was able to start the conversation with them. And it was such a great building belonging activity because we're able to make connections and show the similarities that we all had and all the things that were in common with us. And it really helped build the culture of who we are, what we're charged to do, and what we're going to do going forward. So if you get a chance to do that, I highly recommend that. Also, too, I guess there was a question about where are the resources for equity, and one of our attendees put in the chat. There's the Equity Literacy Institute has some very good equity training for leaders, and that website is www.equityliteracy.org. Equity literacy is one word.
Thank you to all of my colleagues. I want to start just a little bit. Tom mentioned you should tell a little bit about yourself. And so I'm in an area where I actually am probably one of the only people of color in my school district. And so having these conversations is personal to me, but it is also was very difficult for me to start these conversations because really, I'm not sure that everybody thought that was a conversation that needed to be had because of the population at this school, that the population of the children that attend here and the people that live here. But as one of our other task force members, Jeremy in Michigan, forget Jeremy's last name, he and I were preparing for this because this is really his wheelhouse, this conversation, and I kind of interviewed him for this. He gave me a quote from Dr. Daniel Tatum, and it is, we are living in, Jeremy Patterson, that's right, we are living in the smoggy environment of prejudice, meaning even though you may not think it affects you, prejudice is a smog, and it affects all of us. We're all breathing the same air, so it's important for all of us, regardless of what our background is, to really delve into this and be concerned about others. And so one of the ways to get started, and for myself, it was a struggle. I'm like, how do I start this conversation? Well, one of the things Jeremy and I talk about is prioritizing continuing education about bias. I should be on the next slide, by the way, about bias in the classroom and keep it in the forefront every single day. If we keep that as our mission, as we walk inside of our schools and walk our hallways, if we keep that in the forefront of every single practice that we do, as Annette said, you walk around the classroom and you see where are some of the things that look like the children in those classes. How is it reflected in the literature? How is it reflected in the materials that you use and the things that are the conversations that you have? So keep it in the forefront. The other thing too is when we started a conversation here in my school, I had to really kind of, as I said to some of my task force members, like keep it real. Starting for me was hard because of the population that I was in. And I just really had to acknowledge, I came to the table and I said to everybody, we're going to take the implicit association test, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Somebody else will do that. It's a tool. It helps you to gather a baseline for your conversation that you want to have. I know everything. And so some of these things are better done in person, and I did realize that. But the implicit association test I assigned as an independent assignment, I think I gave them a month to do it on their own time, and I told them there were no right or no wrong answers, because when you go to take the test, you'll see that some of them really make you think, and you have to take it quickly. There's no time to think. You're supposed to just answer how it comes to you. And for me, when we sat down as a staff, and I did do that, by the time we did this, it was June, and we did it in person at that point, because I wanted to, A, meet in small groups. This was certainly not a conversation that was really had well with the entire faculty. I didn't want people to feel like they didn't have to speak or couldn't speak. So I did it in small groups. I did it in grade levels, 1 and 2 grade levels at a time, and we met in person. I started the conversation with full disclosure that my bias that I wanted to identify was that even as a young teacher, even until I had my own son 16 years ago, my bias was teaching boys. I laid it out there. I just had an issue with teaching boys. I felt like they weren't as attentive. I actually went to an all-women's college, and I did my student teaching in an all-girls private school. So I had lots of experience with girls, not so much with boys, and they always seemed to be the fly in my ointment. So I brought that bias to the table. But I did acknowledge to folks, once I had my own son, and God did that to me, I had my own child, my own boy, that bias kind of went out the window, and I developed a sensitivity to having boys and how they learn in the classroom. And certainly when he got into school, I actually brought that bias, and having an African-American son come into a classroom, all that I'd heard, all of the bias that I knew about, I brought into that as a parent as well. So I did identify that for folks. I said, like, this is where I am. So I want everybody to feel comfortable having this conversation, and I don't want anybody to feel like you're wrong for whatever your feelings are. There should be no shame in this conversation. It really is for a conversation for all of us to better each other, to be aware of it, and to really work on those things that you know are kind of bias that you bring to the table, because it only serves to benefit you as a leader and your students, ultimately, that's who we care about. So we established those ground rules. And then finally, one of the things that, one of the reasons, well, if you need a reason to have a conversation, and I felt like, honestly, I did need a reason to have a conversation because this place and where I work is not a very diverse place. So I felt like in my head that I needed a reason. Use the data. Look at your disproportionality as it pertains to test scores. If your test scores, I mean, that's something very much that you can look at. That's nothing that you can argue with. A lot of times your test scores may look a certain way with either boys or girls or low income or your Hispanic students or your ELL learners. Use that data. Use that data to say, folks, we have to have this conversation because we have a group of students that are not doing well, and we need to examine the reasons why that might be. So those are the things of how I got started. And as I say got started, I started this sitting on this task force. I didn't really have the meat and potatoes conversation until June of last year. We get out of school, second week of June. I think I had this the first week of June. So this was a conversation we started at the end of the year that we are still continuing. I by far am no expert. I learned from the folks that sit on the committee with me. And this is going to be actually part of my professional development plan this year in this district to continue having these conversations because they're really important to have. That's what I have to add. That's how I started, and my journey continues.
So we've all been talking about implicit bias, and what is that? There's two types of biases, implicit and explicit. Explicit are more of your declared beliefs. Implicit, another name for it, is unconscious bias, and as Annette had mentioned before, everyone possesses biases. And these biases, you know, sometimes because they are unconscious, in your unconscious, they may not necessarily align with what your declared beliefs are, or what you believe, or reflect stances that you would take out loud. Generally, though, they tend to favor what your in-group is, but there are many times when they don't favor what your in-group is. And what I find very interesting about implicit bias is that they can gradually be unlearned. And I'll talk a little bit about that in about a minute. Next, please. So I think we've all talked about the implicit association test. That's the influence that this test had over our committee. It was very eye-opening. And that can be taken by anybody for free at the website that's on the screen in front of you. And there are several different types of IATs. What we've been talking about is the race test. So when you go there, just select race test and then you can start it right away. One thing that I found very helpful when I took it, and I've taken this a number of times, I had taken it before I was on this task force, and I've taken it several times since I've been on this task force. I try to do a lot of reflection around what my results are. And one thing that I try to look at is I try to ask myself these questions. Am I surprised by the results? Do I agree with the results? Because if you look at the research of it, there is some controversy to the research to it also. And then have you taken it before, and are your results the same or are they different? And then the big part to me is reflecting on the results, and is that going to change or influence any decision I make at school or any decision I make in my lifetime? And I think when you take it, it's extremely important to think those things through, especially to the similar and different, like I said, implicit biases can be unlearned. And we've partnered with the Project Implicit. And if you, we can go to the next slide. And Project Implicit this is their website, a QR code to get there. You can also reach the IATs at the Project Implicit website. And we've partnered, our task force has partnered with Project Implicit. NAESP did a few webinars, 3 webinars last spring. And that's a great website to go for resources on equity and on implicit and explicit biases and strategies to mitigate your implicit biases. We can go to the next slide. And this is an excellent 2 handouts that's done through Project Implicit. where they give you what strategies you could use that impact reduction strategies and bias reduction strategies. I got to tell you, they work because I've reflected on these. I've tried to implement them. And the times I've retaken the IAT test, I've seen changes in my results, which actually to me were very surprising. So I know that this is an excellent way to go.
Go to the next slide. Thank you. So we also want to share a little bit about research that helps us to understand how principals and the actions that we take specifically will include those around implicit bias and equity. How do those actions of principals affect the entire school? So we looked at the study, How Principals Affect Students in Schools, that was published this past spring by the Wallace Foundation in partnership with Vanderbilt Peabody, NC State, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the Urban Institute. And we're going to just do a quick summary of the report, but it's really important to know that the research showed that there is a great connection, as we know, of school leadership and student achievement and other outcomes. There were 3 main questions that were addressed, and one of those main questions specifically talked about how do principals contribute to being effective in shaping the characteristics and the skills and the behaviors of students. And when we think about equity, we really want to impact that. Here you will see some of the synthesis of the research, the 4 principal practices that change those things. So high levels of instructional activities, building a productive culture and climate, facilitating those communities and collaborations within your community, and being very strategic about who you hire and the resources that you use within your school. So these are the contributing factors to how principals drive changes in their schools and making the schools more equitable and improving student outcomes are listed here. It's a little hard to see, so I will share what they are. Engaging in instructional focused interactions with teachers, building a productive school climate, facilitating productive collaboration in professional learning communities, managing personnel, which we just talked about, and resources strategically, understanding the people in your building, the instruction in your building, and your whole organization and its goals. From an equity perspective, the research showed that principals can have an important impact on key populations, including low-income students and teachers of color. The impact can occur through direct channels, which might include, our disciplinary practices, and indirect channels, which also include working with teachers to implement culturally responsive teaching practices. There was an important note that principals of color may also be very high leverage actors in this regard. However, we know that there is great disparity when we look at the numbers of principals and school leaders of color that are in our schools. There is inequity in the number of school leaders that are of color. So these are some of the implications of for policymakers and those of us who are practitioners and for researchers. And it summarizes some of the key findings. Again, effective principals have a great impact on student achievement, second only to teachers. And it's important that that's noted, especially when we talk about advocacy and professional development funding. Principals, again, are very substantial in those effects, and principals have to lead instructionally in a way that balances out teachers working with students of various cultures and building a school climate that facilitates collaboration and professional learning. In addition, principals have to develop an equity lens when it comes to the needs and growing, helping students who are marginalized grow. And effective principals don't just distribute that work. They are a big part of the equity work. And they understand that the more that we know about racial and ethnically diverse, the more that we work to become more racially and ethnically diverse. As far as our school leaders, we can better represent those students and fill those gaps for those students. Even though the research is variable, it is very important that the research continues and that we continue to invest our time in knowing how our members and school leaders need support. So some of the final outcomes of that research shows how we need to pivot and reset. We need to continue to reorient our schools where principals can work towards being educationally equitable and prioritizing the needs of our diverse student populations. And that cultural responsiveness and equity include being fair and just and non-discriminatory in our practices and in our classrooms. So at NAESP, we've had the opportunity to share many resources with our members over the last year, almost year and a half. The task force has been in place. And these are some tools available on NAESP's website. Each of us has had the opportunity to write articles and to do blogs, to share with you some of the information we've talked about today, and also just reflections on our own personal experiences and understanding our own biases. And you can go to the next slide. So the next 3 slides, I think, show just some of these articles and blogs that we've done. So we'll now take a look at some of the questions in the chat and address any of the questions you might have.
So one of the questions that came up early on that I'm going to read to you is, where and how can we as typical administrators get in-depth training for equity and diversity if we don't have that background? What would you suggest on that?
I'll start. So there were several suggestions in the chat. Also, I would say many school districts have started their own departments that focus on equity, so diversity and equity and inclusion. I think it's important to understand the policy and practices of your district and to start with those resources. However, there are ways that you can also get involved with other organizations. Some of the ones that we mentioned have done pilot studies with schools and also will actually do training with your school. So you can look at those in the chat and also in the slides that we shared. So when we talked about Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium, they do work directly with schools to begin to do those equity audits, but also interpret them and begin to do training to make changes in your school.
Okay. Another question that has come up is, what kind of challenges have you guys seen as you've done these equity audits and as you've taken steps toward becoming more equitable? What kind of challenges have you seen and overcome?
I think the biggest challenge is, once you once you go and look within yourself and with your staff, it's understanding, it's giving people time to regroup and to understand, because sometimes, when people take the surveys, it's very personal. And I think the biggest thing is to be listeners and, again, to be free to speak and offer that safe environment. Because there is nothing wrong with discussion and talking about what makes us comfortable and what makes us uncomfortable. And like I said, I think the biggest challenge with all the racial issues that we were going through these past years and continue to, I think the biggest challenge was just to speak freely and to speak about it. So it's the process of being okay with being uncomfortable in order to solve the problems for our schools. I think that's the biggest challenge, is getting over that part.
I agree with Annette. It's starting that conversation, because it's such an uncomfortable conversation, and it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, particularly, as we're hearing throughout the country. I don't know if it's happening in your districts. I can say it's happened in our district, but not as extensive, is people coming to school boards and arguing about or shooting down that we're teaching CRT. I haven't specifically had that question yet. I'm kind of waiting for it, because my answer is going to be, you tell me what it is and I'll tell you if we teach it. But it is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable knowing it's uncomfortable. But asking that question or starting that conversation, that's the first step. Understanding, though, that's a huge step to take.
I actually had a question for the panel too, and this may have been a part of the information that was in Liza's presentation, but when we talk about curriculum and we see that the curriculum materials that we currently have, that a lot of prominent different people of ethnicity and history aren't necessarily focused in that material, what kind of supplemental materials are you providing, or is your faculty looking at to address that?
Dr. Grace, I'm going to try to answer this question. I was one who came across that. There were certain things in the curriculum that did not relate to the coaches in my building. And what we did is, as a group, teachers reviewed the curriculum and they were able to identify some of the disparity. So we got input from the staff. We went as far as getting input from students as well as from parents. One of the things we were addressing was the classroom library and what some of the books that needed to be there to reflect on the culture within the building. I have to say it does take time. There was a lot of research within your own school, being transparent, reflecting constantly and being honest with the school community that there must be a change. And going back to what, and also being able to change the curriculum. Right now we had to change our reading curriculum because it didn't reflect a lot of the things. Were there a lot of people that were happy with that? No. But as a school and as a group, you have to stand up and explain and have those uncomfortable conversations. And it's not just one time, it's constantly, and most important, reflecting all the time, because we start, but this is an ongoing process. So what we did last year, we have to sit down and say, okay, is this what we need to help our students? Is this really targeting our subgroups, whether they're L's, what students need, homeless children? Is this really doing the work? Are we providing that environment to lead to the expectations, not lowering our expectations, but how do we continue to rise those expectations? And one more example, which was been brought up, just because people, we have a lot of English language learners, just because they don't know how to speak the language does not mean that they don't know how to read in their native language or do math in their native language. It's a matter of how can we interpret to reach their needs to help them rise to the expectation of getting a good education and really focusing on pushing them ahead. So it's giving them those right tools. But as a team, you need input from more stakeholders.
And to extend on that, is also talking to your recent graduates. I mean, who better to talk about their views on the curriculum, their experiences, is talking to the person that was doing the learning. And usually recent graduates are more than willing to share their experience, their views on the curriculum, and it's making sure that you're also involving students in those conversations.
I might just add on my end. In my district, it's not necessarily a matter of the literature and the resources looking like the students, because it's a majority population here, but it is still important for these students in a majority population to see children of color and other folks of color in a positive light. And so my job has been to not only represent that myself, but make sure the literature and the resources we have within our school setting represent the melting pot that represents America.
So there's a question on that says, are there any types of equity walk tools that support the assessment and data collection of looking at school designs, artwork, books? We shared an equity walk tool that looks at classroom and school resources. I'm not sure if that's if that addresses all of the question, but when you go back, when the slides are shared, you can scan that QR code and it will take to the 3 equity audits that looks at school level, school-wide level, classroom level, and working with teachers.
And if I may add to that, Dr. Kimbrough, it's also in the equity, they have specific questions, such as the instructional strategy. They'll ask questions as, are they asking challenging and engaging questions to develop higher order and critical thinking skills? So it does ask questions, and then the classroom teacher can answer, is it really done every day or is it never done? So that gives you an insight as to the instructional strategies in the classroom or the school climate. So looking at MIEC, Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium, it does have questions that teachers can be very honest to themselves and see, and then school leaders can analyze it and see where where changes need to be done or next steps. So the questions are within the tool.
I just wanted to add something that as a staff, NAESP went through the implicit bias training, and it was also at a time that we were redoing our 3-year strategic plan. And so I think that all of us made a concerted effort as we looked at formulating our goals in each of our areas at NAESP for the next 3 years to really look at that through an equity lens. And I know for professional learning, as different activities or different things come up, looking at our procedures and protocols to make sure that they're equitable and that we're giving opportunities for example, on the professional learning advisory, when we sent that out, that invitation to join or to be on the advisory council, we sent that application to all of our members, but we also included a demographic question because we want to make sure that as we're putting councils and committees and together at NAESP, that we have great representation of our membership. So I just wanted to add that. It's step by step, a little, of course, at a time, but that is an association. We're also doing things internally as we look at our protocols and procedures. So if there aren't any more questions, I just wanted to thank our great panel for sharing all of their knowledge, ideas, strategies. There were a lot of resources that I saw that were being shared in the chat, not only by our panelists, but also by participants in the webinar. And we really, really thank you for that. We know that our work on the task force, we're always a work in progress. But when I saw the title today, I love the title of the webinar, To Pivot and Reset. I had the opportunity to hear Heidi Hayes Jacobs earlier in the year, and she was talking about we can recover during this time of our pandemic, and that just means that we're going back to the way we've always done business, or we can refresh and take what we have done the best and just kind of refresh that. But the third possibility, and the one that she was urging, is a part of the title today. Let's reset. Let's use this as an opportunity to take a hard look at what we're doing, get it right, and be bolder and more necessary. And I love that about her advice to us. And I feel like what you shared on the panel today really reinforces that. So thank you for being here. And I'm just looking forward to the work of the task force and what you'll be accomplishing in the future.